The silver wedding band caught the harsh afternoon sunlight as Margaret Hayes pressed it into the trembling palm of Doc Whitmore, her voice breaking when she whispered that her daughter's fever had climbed too high for prayers alone to save her now. The year was 1878, and Prospect Creek, Montana Territory, had never seen a summer this unforgiving. The drought had turned the grasslands to brittle straw, and with the water sources dwindling, sickness had crept into town like a thief in the night. Margaret's daughter, 8-year-old Lily, had fallen ill 3 days prior, and what had started as a simple cough had transformed into something far more sinister. The child's skin burned with fever, her breath came in shallow gasps, and Margaret had exhausted every home remedy she knew. Doc Whitmore was a gray-haired man with kind eyes that had witnessed too much suffering in his 60 years. He looked down at the simple silver band in his hand, noting the inscription inside that read, "Forever yours, Thomas." His throat tightened with sympathy. "Mrs. Hayes, your husband, is dead these 2 years past," Margaret interrupted, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her dusty cheeks. "Consumption took him in the winter of '76. This ring is all I have left of him, but Lily is all I have left in this world. She is breathing still, doctor, and I mean to keep her that way." The medicine Doc Whitmore provided was expensive, imported from back east, and the ring barely covered half the cost. But he was not a cruel man, and he pressed a bottle of fever reducer and a packet of powder into Margaret's hands, waving away the deficit with a sad shake of his head. Margaret clutched the precious medicine to her chest and hurried back to the small boarding house where she and Lily occupied a single room on the second floor. The boarding house stood on the edge of town, a weathered 2-story structure that had seen better days. Margaret worked there as a cook and housekeeper in exchange for room and board, rising before dawn to prepare meals for the miners and ranch hands who paid for temporary lodging. It was honest work, but it left little time for anything else, and even less money for emergencies. She administered the medicine to Lily with shaking hands, whispering prayers between doses. The little girl's blonde hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat, and her blue eyes, so like her father's, were glassy and unfocused. Margaret stayed awake all night, bathing her daughter's face with cool water and singing the lullabies Thomas had once sung to them both. As dawn broke over the mountains, Lily's fever finally broke. The child opened her eyes and asked for water in a small, hoarse voice that was the most beautiful sound Margaret had ever heard. She wept with relief, holding her daughter close and thanking God for sparing her precious girl. 3 days later, when Lily was strong enough to sit up and take broth, Margaret allowed herself to venture into town for supplies. The loss of her wedding ring sat heavy on her heart, a physical ache that matched the one she had carried since Thomas's death. She had worn that band every day for 10 years, and her finger felt naked without it. But Lily was alive, and that was worth any sacrifice. The general store was busy that morning, filled with ranch hands stocking up before heading back to their respective spreads. Margaret moved through the aisles quickly, selecting only what she absolutely needed when she heard a commotion near the front counter. "That ring was in your window yesterday," a deep voice said, patient but firm. "I have the money right here." "Sold it this morning to a prospector heading toward Helena," the shopkeeper replied with a shrug. "Got a good price for it too, silver's silver, and that was a nice piece." Margaret's heart sank. She had not realized Doc Whitmore had sold her ring to the general store, though it made sense. He would need to recoup his costs somehow. She moved closer, drawn by curiosity and a masochistic need to know who had purchased the last physical reminder of her marriage. The man at the counter was tall, with broad shoulders that filled out his dusty shirt and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. He could not have been much older than 30, with sun-weathered skin and green eyes that held a mixture of frustration and disappointment. A cowboy, clearly, from the worn leather chaps and the well-used revolver at his hip. "When did he leave?" the cowboy asked. "About an hour ago, heading north," the shopkeeper said, already losing interest in the conversation as other customers pressed forward with their purchases. The cowboy's jaw tightened, and he turned away from the counter, nearly colliding with Margaret. His hands came up instinctively to steady her, and for a moment their eyes met. His were the color of spring grass, she thought absently, alive and vibrant in a way that seemed at odds with the harsh landscape surrounding them. "Pardon me, ma'am," he said, his voice softer now, concerned. "Are you all right?" "Yes, I am fine, thank you," Margaret replied, stepping back and clutching her basket tighter. She could feel heat rising to her cheeks and cursed her fair complexion for betraying her embarrassment. The cowboy tipped his hat and moved past her toward the door, his boots heavy on the wooden floorboards. Margaret watched him go, wondering why a working cowboy would have such interest in a simple wedding band. Perhaps it had belonged to his mother or a lost love. She shook her head, dismissing the thought. It was none of her concern, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. Margaret completed her shopping and stepped out into the bright sunlight, shading her eyes against the glare. The street was busy with the usual traffic of horses, wagons, and people going about their daily business. She was about to head back toward the boarding house when she heard a sharp cry from the alley beside the general store. Without thinking, she hurried toward the sound, her heart racing. In the narrow space between buildings, she found a young boy, no more than 6 years old, clutching his arm and crying. A large crate had fallen from a loading platform above, and the child had been struck. "Let me see," Margaret said gently, kneeling beside him. The boy was terrified, his dark eyes wide with pain and fear. She carefully examined his arm, relieved to find it was not broken, though a nasty bruise was already forming. "You will be all right, sweetheart. Can you tell me your name?" "Miguel," the boy whimpered. "Well, Miguel, I need you to be very brave for me," Margaret said, her voice calm and soothing despite her racing heart. She tore a strip from her petticoat and fashioned a makeshift sling supporting his injured arm. "There now. Does that feel better?" The boy nodded, his tears slowing. Margaret looked around for his parents, but the alley was empty. "Where is your mother, Miguel?" "At the laundry," he said, pointing vaguely toward the east end of town. "I was playing. I was not supposed to be here." Margaret helped him to his feet and guided him out of the alley. She would take him to the laundry herself and explain what had happened. As they emerged onto the main street, she nearly collided with someone for the second time that day. It was the cowboy from the general store. "Ma'am," he said, then noticed the boy. His expression shifted immediately to concern. "What happened?" "A crate fell on him," Margaret explained quickly. "His arm is injured, but I do not think it is broken. I am taking him to his mother at the laundry." The cowboy crouched down to the boy's level, his movements gentle despite his size. "That was a close call, son. You are lucky this lady was here to help you." He looked up at Margaret, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "The laundry is on my way. Let me carry him for you." Before Margaret could protest, he had scooped Miguel up carefully, mindful of the injured arm. The boy did not protest, seeming to sense that this stranger meant him no harm. They walked together through town, Margaret directing the way while the cowboy kept up an easy conversation with Miguel, distracting him from his pain. "My name is Cole," he said as they walked. "Cole Brennan. I work at the Double R Ranch about 10 miles south of here." "Margaret Hayes," she replied, surprised by how natural it felt to walk beside him. "I work at the boarding house." They found Miguel's mother at the laundry, a small, worried woman who rushed forward when she saw her son in Cole's arms. There was a rapid exchange in Spanish, and then she was thanking them both profusely, tears streaming down her face. Margaret assured her that Miguel would be fine with rest, and they left mother and son together. On the walk back toward the center of town, Cole seemed hesitant to part ways. "That was kind what you did for that boy," he said. "Not everyone would have stopped to help. I have a daughter," Margaret said simply. "I would hope someone would do the same for her." Something flickered across Cole's face, an emotion she could not quite read. They had reached the corner where their paths would diverge, and Margaret felt an unexpected reluctance to say goodbye. This man was a stranger, and yet there was something about his steady presence that made her feel safe in a way she had not felt since Thomas died. "Thank you for your help with Miguel," she said, extending her hand formally. Cole took it, his grip warm and firm. "It was my pleasure, Mrs. Hayes." He hesitated, then added, "That ring the shopkeeper mentioned, the silver one. Can I ask, did it have an inscription inside, something about forever?" Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "Yes, how did you know?" "I bought it from Doc Whitmore yesterday," Cole said, his voice gentle. "He mentioned it had come from a widow who had traded it for medicine for her sick child. I wanted to buy it and return it to you, but when I went back this morning, the shopkeeper said he had sold it to a prospector." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes, overwhelmed by the kindness of this stranger. "You tried to buy it for me, but why? You do not even know me." Cole's expression was earnest, almost vulnerable. "My mother died when I was 10. Before she passed, she made my father promise to always help widows and orphans because she knew what it was like to struggle alone. My father kept that promise until the day he died, and I have tried to do the same. When Doc Whitmore told me about your sacrifice, I knew I had to try to get that ring back to you." Margaret was speechless. In her experience, most men looked out for themselves first, and kindness was often transactional. But Cole Brennan seemed to be offering help with no expectation of anything in return. "That is extraordinarily kind," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "But the medicine saved my daughter's life. The ring was a worthy trade." "Still," Cole said, "I am going to track down that prospector. If I can get the ring back, I will bring it to you. You have my word." Before Margaret could respond, he tipped his hat and strode away, leaving her standing on the corner with her heart racing and her mind spinning with questions. That evening, as Margaret tucked Lily into bed, her daughter asked about the tall man she had seen through the window earlier. "Who was that, Mama?" "Just a kind cowboy," Margaret said, smoothing the blonde hair back from Lily's forehead. "No one important." But as she lay in her own narrow bed later that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the boarding house settling around her, Margaret could not stop thinking about Cole Brennan and his promise. She told herself it was foolish to get her hopes up. The prospector could be anywhere by now, and even if Cole did manage to track him down, there was no guarantee he would be willing to sell the ring back. Yet something in Cole's eyes had told her he was a man who kept his promises. 5 days passed. Lily grew stronger each day, her appetite returning along with her energy. Margaret threw herself into her work, trying not to think about the cowboy who had ridden north in search of a simple silver band. She told herself it did not matter, that the ring was just an object, that her memories of Thomas were safe in her heart regardless, but her fingers still felt naked without it. On the 6th day, Margaret was in the kitchen preparing the evening meal when Mrs. Patterson, who owned the boarding house, poked her head through the doorway. "Margaret, there is a man here to see you, says his name is Cole Brennan." Margaret's heart leaped into her throat. She wiped her hands on her apron and hurried to the front parlor where Cole stood turning his hat in his hands. He looked tired, covered in trail dust, but his face lit up when he saw her. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, a smile tugging at his lips. "I have something for you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small cloth bundle. When he unwrapped it, the silver wedding band gleamed in the lamplight. Margaret gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "How did you?" she began, but her voice failed her. "Tracked the prospector to a mining camp about 40 miles north," Cole said. "He was not particularly interested in selling at first, but I made him an offer he could not refuse." He held the ring out to her, and Margaret noticed his knuckles were bruised and scabbed. He had fought for it. With trembling hands, she reached for the ring, but Cole gently caught her left hand instead. "May I?" he asked softly. Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Cole slipped the ring onto her finger, his touch careful and reverent. It fit perfectly, settling into the familiar groove it had worn over 10 years of constant wear. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. Thank you so much, but how much do I owe you? I cannot possibly— Nothing, Cole said firmly. You owe me nothing, Mrs. Hayes. This is a gift, no strings attached. Margaret looked up at him, this man who had ridden 40 miles and fought a prospector to return something precious to a woman he barely knew, and felt something shift inside her chest. It was not love, not yet, but it was the first flicker of something she had thought died with Thomas. Hope, perhaps, or the possibility of happiness. At least let me make you dinner, she said, her voice steadier now. You must be exhausted. Cole's smile widened. I would like that very much. Margaret led him to the kitchen, where she prepared a plate of the beef stew and fresh bread she had made for the boarders. Cole ate with the focused intensity of a man who had not had a proper meal in days, and Margaret found herself watching him, noticing small things. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the gentleness in his hands despite their obvious strength, the patience with which he answered Lily's dozens of questions when the little girl crept downstairs, drawn by the sound of a stranger's voice. Are you really a cowboy? Lily asked, her eyes wide with fascination. Yes, ma'am, Cole said seriously, treating her question with the gravity it deserved. I work with cattle and horses at the Double R Ranch. Do you have a horse? Lily pressed. I do. His name is Thunder, and he is the smartest horse in Montana Territory, Cole said, and Margaret could hear the affection in his voice. Maybe sometime, if your mother says it is all right, I could take you to meet him. Lily looked at Margaret with such hope that Margaret could not help but smile. We will see, she said, the traditional mother's response that meant probably yes. Cole stayed for 2 hours, helping Margaret clean up the kitchen and talking about everything and nothing. He told her about growing up on a ranch in Wyoming, about losing his parents to influenza when he was 20, about drifting for a few years before finding steady work at the Double R. Margaret found herself sharing things she had not talked about in years, her childhood in Ohio, meeting Thomas at a church social, the journey west that had been full of such hope and promise. When Cole finally took his leave, he paused at the door. May I call on you again, Mrs. Hayes? Properly, I mean, if that would not be too forward. Margaret felt warmth bloom in her chest, a sensation she had almost forgotten. I would like that, Mr. Brennan, and please call me Margaret. Only if you will call me Cole, he replied, his smile bright enough to rival the evening stars just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Over the following weeks, Cole became a regular visitor at the boarding house. He would ride into town on his days off, always bringing something small for Lily. A carved wooden horse, a bright ribbon for her hair, a sweet peppermint stick from the general store. For Margaret, he brought wildflowers picked from the range, their bright colors a stark contrast to the dusty browns and grays of late summer. They would sit on the boarding house porch in the evenings after Margaret finished her work, talking while Lily played nearby. Cole spoke of his dreams of someday owning his own ranch, a small spread where he could raise horses and cattle and build a life worth living. Margaret shared her hope of eventually having a little house of her own, a place where she and Lily could put down real roots instead of living in borrowed rooms. You deserve that, Cole said one evening, his voice intense with sincerity. You deserve a home and security and someone to take care of you for a change. Margaret felt her cheeks warm. I have managed well enough on my own. I know you have, Cole said quickly. That is not what I meant. I just mean that you should not have to carry every burden alone. Everyone needs help sometimes. Their hands were resting on the porch railing, inches apart. Cole slowly moved his pinky finger until it touched hers, a question and an offer all at once. Margaret's heart raced, but she did not pull away. Instead, she let her finger curl around his, a small gesture that felt monumental. The town began to notice their growing attachment, and opinions were mixed. Some of the women who had known Margaret since she arrived in Prospect Creek were happy to see her finding companionship. Others whispered that it was too soon, that she was disrespecting Thomas's memory by allowing another man to court her. Margaret tried not to let the gossip bother her, but some nights she lay awake wondering if they were right. Was she betraying Thomas by caring for Cole? She confided her concerns to Mrs. Patterson one morning while they were kneading bread together. The older woman listened patiently, then fixed Margaret with a knowing look. "Your Thomas was a good man, from what you have told me," Mrs. Patterson said. "Do you think he would want you to spend the rest of your life alone and grieving?" "No," Margaret admitted. "He made me promise before he died that I would not give up on living, that I would find joy again for Lily's sake if not my own." "Then there is your answer," Mrs. Patterson said simply. "Loving again does not erase the love you had before. The heart is not a finite thing, Margaret. It grows to accommodate what we need it to hold." Those words stayed with Margaret, offering comfort when doubt crept in. She began to allow herself to truly feel the growing affection she had for Cole, to admit that what had started as gratitude had blossomed into something deeper and more complex. Cole, for his part, was patient and respectful, never pushing for more than Margaret was ready to give. He did not try to kiss her or make declarations of love. Instead, he showed his feelings through steady, reliable action. When a storm damaged part of the boarding house roof, Cole spent his day off making repairs. When Lily mentioned wanting to learn to ride a horse, Cole brought Thunder to town and spent an entire afternoon teaching her, his patience infinite as the little girl shrieked with delight. Margaret watched him with her daughter and felt her heart expand with emotion. Cole was good with Lily, treating her not as an obligation but as a person worthy of his time and attention. He listened when she talked about her father, never seeming jealous or uncomfortable when Thomas's name came up. Instead, he would ask gentle questions, helping Lily keep her memories of her father alive. "You are wonderful with her," Margaret said one evening after they had put an exhausted but happy Lily to bed. "She is a special little girl," Cole replied. "Smart and brave, just like her mother." They were standing close together in the narrow hallway outside Lily's room, close enough that Margaret could feel the warmth radiating from Cole's body. The house was quiet around them, most of the boarders having retired for the night. In the intimate silence, Cole reached up slowly and tucked a loose strand of hair behind Margaret's ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Margaret," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "I know it has not been very long, but I need you to know something. I am falling in love with you. I did not plan for it to happen, and I do not want to rush you or make you uncomfortable. But I cannot keep pretending that what I feel is just friendship." Margaret's breath caught. She looked up into those green eyes and saw nothing but honesty and vulnerability. "Cole, you do not have to say anything right now," Cole interrupted gently. "I just needed you to know where I stand. I will wait as long as you need, Margaret. I am not going anywhere." But Margaret realized with sudden crystal clarity that she did not want him to wait. She had been a widow for 2 years, and while part of her would always carry love for Thomas, she was still alive. She was still capable of feeling and wanting and loving, and what she wanted, more than anything in that moment, was Cole Brennan. "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling both terrifying and exhilarating as they left her lips. "I think I started falling for you the moment you slipped my ring back onto my finger." Cole's face transformed with joy, and he cupped her face in his hands with infinite tenderness. "May I kiss you?" he asked, always the gentleman, always making sure she was ready. "Yes," Margaret breathed, and then his lips were on hers, soft and warm and perfect. The kiss was gentle, almost reverent, and Margaret felt tears slip down her cheeks as 2 years of loneliness and grief began to crack open, making room for something new and beautiful. When they finally pulled apart, Cole rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said, the words both a question and a plea. "I know I do not have much to offer right now, just a cowboy's wages and a lot of hope for the future, but I swear I will spend every day of my life making you and Lily happy. I will work hard and I will build us a home and I will love you both with everything I have." Margaret laughed through her tears, overwhelmed by the intensity of her emotions. "Yes," she said, not needing to think about it, not needing time to consider. This felt right in a way that transcended logic. Yes, Cole, I will marry you. They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church on the edge of town. Margaret wore a dress of pale blue cotton that she had sewn herself, with wildflowers woven into her hair. Lily stood beside her as a tiny bridesmaid, beaming with happiness. Cole wore his best shirt and a new vest, and when he looked at Margaret as she walked down the aisle, the love in his eyes was so clear that several women in the congregation wept. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. When it came time for the rings, Cole produced not one but two bands, one for Margaret, and a second silver ring that perfectly complemented the wedding band she already wore, the one he had fought to return to her. "So you can wear both," he explained softly. "Your past and your future together." Margaret could barely speak past the lump in her throat as she slid a simple gold band onto Cole's finger, one she had saved for weeks to purchase. "With this ring, I thee wed," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. The small congregation cheered when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Cole kissed her with a joy that made Margaret's heart soar. Lily threw handfuls of dried flower petals, laughing as they scattered in the autumn breeze. The reception was held at the boarding house with Mrs. Patterson insisting on providing the food and organizing the celebration. The whole town seemed to turn out, even those who had initially disapproved of the hasty courtship. It was hard to maintain skepticism in the face of such obvious happiness. Cole had surprised Margaret by arranging for them to rent a small house on the outskirts of town, a 2-bedroom cabin with a porch and a view of the mountains. It was not much, but it was theirs, and when he carried her over the threshold that evening with Lily dancing excitedly around them, Margaret felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. "Welcome home, Mrs. Brennan," Cole said, setting her gently on her feet and pulling her close. "Home," Margaret repeated, savoring the word. For the first time since Thomas's death, she truly felt like she had one. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. Money was tight, and Cole's work at the ranch often meant long hours and days away from home. But they faced every difficulty together, and Margaret discovered that having a partner again made even the hardest moments bearable. Cole was true to his word about loving Lily as his own, and the little girl blossomed under his steady, patient attention. She began calling him Papa Cole, and the first time she did, Margaret saw tears shine in her husband's eyes. They fell into comfortable rhythms. Margaret continued her work at the boarding house for a while, needing the income, but Cole insisted she keep the money for herself rather than pooling everything. "You should have something of your own," he said firmly. "I will not have my wife going without." On Sunday afternoons, they would pack a picnic and ride out to a spot Cole had discovered by a creek, where the water still ran clear and cottonwood trees provided shade. Lily would wade in the shallows, catching minnows and building dams, while Margaret and Cole sat together on a blanket, his arm around her shoulders, talking about their dreams and plans. "I have been saving," Cole told her one such afternoon, about 8 months into their marriage. "The foreman at the Double R is getting old, and the owner has hinted that I might be considered for the position when he retires next spring. It comes with better pay and a house on the ranch property." Margaret twisted to look at him, excitement building in her chest. "Cole, that would be wonderful." "It is not certain yet," he cautioned, but she could see the hope in his eyes. "But if it happens, we would have more stability, and maybe in a few years we could start thinking about buying our own land." "I have been saving too," Margaret confessed. "Every penny I can spare from my wages. I have almost $50 put away now." Cole pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "We are going to build something good, Margaret, I promise you that." As the seasons changed and their first anniversary approached, Margaret realized she had something important to tell Cole. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had wanted to be certain before saying anything. One evening, after Lily had gone to bed, she took Cole's hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "I am with child," she said softly, watching his face carefully. They had never discussed whether Cole wanted children of his own, and sudden fear gripped her. What if this was not welcome news? But Cole's face crumbled into an expression of such pure joy that Margaret's fears evaporated instantly. "Truly?" he asked, his voice breaking. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes," Margaret confirmed, laughing as he swept her into his arms and spun her around. "Sometime next spring, if Doc Whitmore is correct." Cole set her down carefully, as if she were suddenly made of glass, and dropped to his knees in front of her. He pressed his face against her stomach, his arms wrapped around her hips. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for this gift." Margaret ran her fingers through his dark hair, overcome with love for this man who had given her back a future worth living. "We are blessed," she said simply. The pregnancy was easier than her first had been, perhaps because she was not simultaneously grieving a dying husband and wondering how she would survive alone. Cole was attentive and protective, fussing over her in ways that were endearing even when they bordered on excessive. He got the foreman position at the Double R as hoped, and they moved into a larger house on the ranch property in March, just weeks before the baby was due. Lily was excited about becoming a big sister, though she had very specific opinions about what the baby should be named. "If it is a girl, we should call her Rose," she announced one evening at dinner. "And if it is a boy, Thunder, like Cole's horse." Cole choked on his coffee, and Margaret tried very hard not to laugh. "Those are lovely suggestions, sweetheart," she managed to say. "But I think we might need to consider a few other options as well." The baby arrived on a warm April evening in 1880, after a labor that was mercifully short. Cole paced outside the bedroom door the entire time, refusing to leave even when Mrs. Patterson, who had come to help with the delivery, told him he should go tend to the horses or find some other distraction. When Margaret finally called out that he could come in, he burst through the door, his face pale with worry. "A son," Margaret said, exhausted but radiant, holding out the tiny bundle wrapped in soft cotton. "We have a son, Cole." Cole approached slowly, reverently, as if afraid he might break something. When he took the baby into his arms, Margaret watched his face transform with wonder. "He is perfect," Cole breathed. "Absolutely perfect." They named him Thomas Cole Brennan, honoring both the father Lily had lost and the man who had chosen to be her father now. When Lily was allowed in to meet her baby brother, she was uncharacteristically quiet, gently touching his tiny hand with one finger. "He is so small," she whispered. "You were this small once," Margaret told her, pulling her eldest close, "and you will be such a wonderful big sister to him." As the baby, called Tommy from the start to distinguish him from his namesake, grew and thrived, Margaret sometimes found herself overwhelmed by how much her life had changed in just 2 years. She would look around the comfortable house, at her healthy children, at the husband who loved her so completely, and wonder how she had gotten so lucky. There were still hard days, times when she missed Thomas with an ache that took her breath away. But those moments grew fewer and farther between, and she had learned that it was possible to honor the past while embracing the present. Cole proved to be as devoted a father to Tommy as he was to Lily. He would walk the floor with the baby for hours when Tommy was colicky, singing off-key lullabies and never complaining about the lost sleep. He taught Lily to read and ride and rope, always patient with her endless questions. And with Margaret, he was unfailingly tender and passionate by turns, making her feel cherished every single day. When Tommy was 6 months old, Cole came home from work one evening with barely contained excitement. "The owner of the Double R is getting too old to manage the ranch," he told Margaret over dinner. "He is looking to sell, and he has offered me first chance to buy him out. It would take everything we have saved plus a loan from the bank, but Margaret, it would be ours. Our own ranch, our own legacy to pass down to the children." Margaret's mind raced, calculating risks and possibilities. It was a huge gamble, but she had learned to trust Cole's judgment. More than that, she had learned to trust in their partnership. "If you think we can make it work, then I am with you," she said firmly. The next 2 years were the hardest they had yet faced as a couple. Taking ownership of the Double R, which they renamed the Brennan Ranch, meant assuming not just assets but debts and responsibilities. They worked from dawn until well past dark most days, Cole managing the cattle and horses while Margaret kept the books and managed the household. There were times when they fell into bed too exhausted to even speak to each other, let alone anything more intimate. But they persevered, and slowly the ranch began to turn a profit. They hired on 3 ranch hands, men who proved to be hardworking and loyal. Cole's reputation for being fair and honest attracted other good workers, and within a year they had expanded their herd significantly. Margaret started selling eggs and butter in town, using her earnings to buy chickens and eventually a dairy cow. Every penny was carefully managed, every expense considered. Lily, now 10 years old, took on more responsibilities around the house and with Tommy, who at 2 was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity. She never complained about the extra work, seeming to understand that they were all working towards something important together. Margaret made sure to spend special time with her daughter, not wanting Lily to feel overlooked in the chaos of building the ranch. One evening, as Margaret was tucking Lily into bed, her daughter asked a question that made Margaret's heart clench. "Mama, do you think my first papa would be happy that we have Cole now?" Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, choosing her words carefully. "I think your first papa loved you so much that he would want you to be happy and safe," she said gently. "And Cole makes us both those things, does he not?" "Yes," Lily agreed. "I love him, Mama. Is that all right? I still remember my first papa, but Cole is my papa too now." "That is more than all right, sweetheart," Margaret assured her, stroking her daughter's hair. "Your heart is big enough to love them both. And I promise you, having Cole in our lives does not mean we have forgotten the man who loved us first." Lily seemed satisfied with this answer and soon drifted off to sleep. Margaret found Cole in their bedroom, reading over the ranch accounts by lamplight. She told him about the conversation and watched his eyes grow bright with unshed tears. "I never wanted to replace her father," Cole said quietly. "I just wanted to love her the best I could." "And you have," Margaret assured him, moving to sit in his lap, the accounts forgotten. "You have been everything to both of us, Cole Brennan, more than I ever dared hope for when I traded my wedding ring for medicine that day." Cole wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. "That ring brought you back to me," he murmured against her hair. "Best $50 I ever spent bribing that prospector to sell it back." Margaret pulled back to look at him in shock. $50? Cole, that is a fortune." "You told me you made him an offer he could not refuse, but I assumed—" "You assumed I threatened him or fought him," Cole finished, grinning. "I did rough him up a bit when he refused my first offer of $20, but in the end, it was money that convinced him. Money well spent, as it brought me the love of my life." Margaret shook her head in amazement, then kissed him deeply. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "So very much." Their third child, a daughter they named Sarah Jane, arrived in the spring of 1883. This pregnancy had been unexpected but welcomed, and Sarah proved to be a calm, sweet-natured baby who rarely fussed. Lily, now 12, was an enormous help with both her younger siblings, and Margaret was grateful for her daughter's capable hands and generous heart. The ranch continued to prosper, slowly but steadily. By Sarah's first birthday, they had paid off half the bank loan and expanded their grazing land by purchasing an adjacent parcel from a neighbor who was relocating to California. Cole hired a full-time foreman, allowing him to spend more time with the family, and Margaret finally felt like they could breathe a bit easier financially. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Cole surprised Margaret with a gift that made her weep. It was a small painted portrait of Thomas, done from the tintype photograph Margaret had kept carefully preserved. "I wanted the children to have something to remember him by as they grow," Cole explained. "Especially Lily. He was her father, and he deserves to be honored in our home." Margaret hung the portrait in the parlor, and it became a touchstone for their family. On quiet evenings, Margaret would tell the children stories about Thomas, how they met, his love of singing, the way he could make anyone laugh. Cole listened to these stories without jealousy, sometimes adding his own observations about what a good man Thomas must have been to have earned Margaret's love. This, Margaret realized, was what true love looked like. Not the erasure of the past, but the honoring of it. Not jealousy and possession, but security and generosity of spirit. When Tommy was 5 and Sarah was 2, Margaret discovered she was pregnant again. This baby, their 4th child and 2nd son, was born in the winter of 1886 and named Samuel Thomas Brennan. With 4 children ranging from 15 years old to newborn, the house was full of noise and chaos and life. Margaret sometimes felt exhausted to her very bones, but she was happy in a way she had never imagined possible during those dark days after Thomas's death. Lily was growing into a beautiful young woman, with suitors already starting to pay attention despite her youth. Cole was as protective as any father could be, meeting each prospective beau with a stern look and a pointed display of his rifle. Margaret had to remind him that Lily needed room to make her own choices, even as she secretly appreciated his fierce protection of their daughter. Tommy and Sarah were inseparable, getting into mischief together with the kind of creativity that made Margaret laugh even as she disciplined them. And baby Samuel was doted on by the entire family, passed from lap to lap and never lacking for attention. The ranch had become one of the most successful in the territory, and Cole's reputation for fair dealing and quality stock brought buyers from across Montana and beyond. They had built a legacy, just as Cole had promised they would. But more than that, they had built a family rooted in love and respect and joy. On a warm summer evening in 1888, Margaret stood on the porch of their home, a proper ranch house now with 6 bedrooms and a wide wraparound porch, and watched her family. Cole was teaching Tommy how to throw a lasso while Sarah cheered them on. Lily was inside preparing dinner, singing softly as she worked. Baby Samuel, now 2 years old, played at Margaret's feet with a set of wooden horses Cole had carved for him. Margaret looked down at her left hand, where both her wedding rings gleamed in the golden sunlight. The original band from Thomas, inscribed with "Forever Yours," and the complimentary ring Cole had given her, which bore the inscription "and forever mine." Together they told the story of her life, loss and love, grief and joy, endings and new beginnings. She heard Cole's footsteps on the porch boards and turned to smile at him as he wrapped his arms around her from behind. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice warm in her ear. "How blessed I am," Margaret said simply, leaning back against his solid warmth. "How a single act of kindness, you buying back my wedding ring, changed everything." "It was not just kindness," Cole corrected gently. "From the moment I saw you in that general store, Margaret, I was drawn to you. I told myself I was just doing a good deed, but the truth is, my heart knew what my head had not yet accepted. That you were going to be mine and I was going to be yours." Margaret turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to cup his beloved face in her hands. 10 years of sun and wind and hard work had weathered his features, added lines around his eyes and threads of silver to his dark hair. But to her, he was more handsome than ever, because now she could see the history written in those lines, the laughter they had shared, the challenges they had overcome, the life they had built together. "Forever yours," she said softly, echoing the inscription on her ring. "And forever mine," Cole replied, touching his forehead to hers. As the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Brennan family gathered for dinner. The table was full of food and conversation and love, children's laughter mixing with parents' voices in the timeless music of home. Margaret looked around at the faces she loved most in the world and felt a profound sense of peace. She had known devastating loss, had felt the desperate fear of a mother watching her child slip away. She had traded the symbol of her first love to save her daughter's life, and in doing so, had somehow made room for a second love she never expected to find. And when a cowboy with green eyes and a generous heart had slipped that ring back onto her finger, he had given her more than a returned possession. He had given her hope and courage and the promise of a future bright enough to honor the past without being trapped by it. Years later, when Lily married a good man from a neighboring ranch, Margaret passed on her original wedding ring. "Your father wanted you to have this," she told her daughter as she slipped it onto Lily's finger. "Both your fathers, the one who gave you life and the one who chose to be your papa. Let it remind you that love can come more than once, and that the heart's capacity for devotion is infinite." Lily wept and embraced her mother, understanding the profound gift she had been given. Margaret kept the ring Cole had given her, wearing it every day until she was an old woman with silver hair and grandchildren climbing on her lap. Even in her final days, decades after that sweltering summer when she had traded everything for medicine and received back more than she could have imagined, she would twist that ring on her finger and remember the fear and the sacrifice. Remember a tall cowboy with kind eyes who had ridden 40 miles to return something precious. Remember the moment he had slipped it back on her finger and how her whole world had shifted with that simple gesture. Remember that sometimes, in the vast and unforgiving landscape of the Wild West, grace appeared in unexpected forms. Sometimes it looked like a medicine bottle and a widow's determination. Sometimes it looked like a cowboy's promise and a silver ring catching the sunlight. And sometimes, if you were very fortunate, it looked like a second chance at happiness, hard-won and deeply cherished, built on a foundation of sacrifice, kindness, and a love strong enough to honor the past while embracing the future. Margaret Hayes Brennan lived to be 83 years old, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them carrying forward the legacy of love she and Cole had built together. When she finally closed her eyes for the last time, she was wearing her wedding ring, and her last thoughts were not of endings but of the beautiful, unexpected beginning that had started the day. Cowboy bought back her wedding band and slipped it onto her finger, binding their hearts together forever. Cole, who had never left her side during her final illness, held her hand as she passed, and whispered the words that had become their private promise to each other through 50 years of marriage. "Forever yours." And in the quiet of that room, surrounded by love and memory and the rich tapestry of a life well lived, Margaret's story came to its gentle, perfect close. A Wild West tale of loss and redemption, of sacrifice rewarded, and of love that proved stronger than grief, enduring through all the seasons of a remarkable life.